Thank you, Katrina. With the long litany there that you started off with, all of the atrocities and so on, one is tempted to give the famous President Lincoln one. But apart from that, how did you do? Usually, how have we done? What we'll do is, if you're clued in, I'll throw out a few questions, make a few comments as is necessary as we go on, and essentially we'll have a conversation in which most of the heavy lifting will be done by the younger members of the panel. And we're going to allow some moments at the end for questions and interventions, so we'll try and guillotine in time for some questions at the end. The question posed, what have we learned? It depends, I suppose, in the first instance, on who are the we. We might start with a narrow and, if you like, almost self-interested focus. What have historians learned about 1913, 22, 23 during the past decade? In effect, what have been the new sources? What kind of new insights have they forced upon us? How would we go about it? And I suppose the obvious place to start would be with the pension applications and the military history stuff, which opened up so many things and which has informed so much of the writing and the reassessments. Would you like to see what has been the value and how has that, in the first instance, transformed our understanding? Sure.
Well, when you consider the title, the Military Service Pensions or the Military Service Pension Archive, you could be forgiven for assuming that you're dealing primarily with military matters. And there are no shortage of military matters. These are the pensions that were generated as a result of the applications made by men and women, the veterans of the period, those who chose to get involved in the process of being recompensed or seeking some kind of recognition around status. And there were those, of course, whose livelihoods were destroyed or disturbed. So there were pressing material matters, but what fascinated me was the extent of the social history, the detritus of the decade, the afterlives, the fracturings. I have described it elsewhere as a chronicle of disappointment because the vast majority of people who applied for pensions were not successful, and yet you get a window onto their sense of their revolution or their involvement or their pain or their pride. There's extraordinary dignity in it as well. And you're dealing with handwritten letters a lot of the time. And you're also, of course, looking at the apparatus of the state and how it handled the process and the bureaucracy that went with it. I learned an awful lot about social conditions, about poverty, about trauma. And I think this is one of the fascinating legacies of this period of excavation and scholarship. We talk much more about trauma. Trauma that was often internalized. But it's laid bare in an awful lot of the correspondence to do with the pensions archive. And pension files can cover the entire decades up to the death of the applicant and sometimes their family members as well. You get a very strong sense of where they are, of where they are situated, but also how they deal with the legacy themselves, their personal legacy, their familial legacy, how they think about comrades, how they dealt with the betrayals that many of them felt. And there's nothing uniquely Irish about that, you know. We're very lucky, and the Pension Archive is a reminder of this, that we have such a brilliantly documented revolution. You don't get that everywhere. It meant we could expand our framework of interpretation. And it's not just about military matters, it's also about the lived experience. What was it like? What did it feel like? What did they feel they were involved in? And many of them, of course, who were involved at a very tender stage. They were very young, you know, they were young men and women. And expanding that framework of interpretation, I think, really enriched Irish historical scholarship. And there's great scope there for the future.
It might be no harm just to flag that the archive first became the first tranche of these became available in the spring of 2014. Which meant that it coincided essentially with the opening, and it right through the decade then it continued to open. You mentioned dignity and desperation, I dare say, would be the other D that one would add into it there. Your experience of the pension files and more generally of the kind of issues it opened out.
I mean, I think it's really opened my eyes in the sense that first of all, I don't conflate what I've learned and what other historians have learned. I think I've learned a lot, and I was just thinking before I came here this morning, I was in my 30s when this started. I am now 50. So as a historian, I think differently because I got older. I'm more, I suppose, appreciative of how hard it is to, make decisions and, live through that part of your life. And what you see in that pension archive is, as you said, the struggles people had in later life, the toll this thing took on people, but not just on the people who took an active part. And what really struck me about it is the degree to which you're seeing the kind of the ripples out into family life, into the lives of those who maybe took no hand actor part in the revolutionary period, but they're suddenly confronted by
the consequences of
the
it.
consequences. And this husband who is now in front of them, who's maybe badly injured or traumatized in whatever way, but also those who've lost, in most cases, children, but how important that child's income had been to their family economy. And particularly in those, what's in that archive and what's wonderful about it is that, yes, you have the people who are applying for pensions, but you have people who are applying for dependence allowances and things. And what you're seeing is just how precarious family incomes were and how dependent people were on their children's income. So that was a big issue for me. A bit like yourself.
And the applications just again had to be accompanied by supporting documentation. It meant that you had different forms of affirmation of things.
And that can be a lottery.
Yes.
Depending on who has survived or who's in a position.
But I suppose what you're also seeing, though, is the degree to which people are interacting with the state and expecting the state to step in and take a role in their lives. And that's shifting across the decades. That's this wonderful thing about this archive, is that it's an archive of 20th century Ireland, not just an archive of the revolution. And its value has to be considered in that way into the future. I suppose one of the other big things that I think historians have started to think about is the treatment of women during the period, particularly violence against women. What struck me, though, if you think about the pensions, a lot of that has come from the pension files and other archives that have become available. But what particularly struck me about the pension files is we haven't thought enough about masculinity. And back to what you were saying, what you're seeing in that pension archive is men growing old and being deeply insecure about what life is like and what it's done to them, which is maybe why it speaks to me in a different way now as I've got older. But that sense of concern about ageing, health, there's a lot of different types of masculinity in there that we haven't really thought about. I think one of the other things we need to think a little bit more about is just how men and women interacted with each other. We've taken huge leap forwards in terms of women's history, but we haven't maybe thought enough in terms of how were men and women interacting with each other then and after. What was violence against women like then, before and after? We need the context of that to make a bit more sense of it. But I think it's really striking too, not just, yes, it's wonderful to think about these new sources, but what I think we've also seen are historians looking at, for want of a better word, old sources in new ways and asking different questions of them. And as I said, over the period of this time, we've more historians working on the period, new faces doing new things and asking big questions of it. Like, really struck by the degree to which we now, far more people are looking at things from the perspective of things like the history of emotions, the history of the environment. I think you launched Justin Stover's book about environmental damage in the period. So we're coming at this from very, very different angles. Which is not something you could have said when I think we would have started studying this. I would have been a bit concerned. It was
the texture of
completely changed.
We talked about aging there. Dan Breen, who I described as a coiled spring of antipathy as a result of reading his correspondence, he was very despondent in the 1930s and basically said, "I've one foot in the grave." And I was showing students footage of him in 1969 for the 50th anniversary of Salahead Beg, pouring forth on television. So his pessimism, ultimately, he triumphed over it. But his wife also features, because she was a Cumla Man member. And when I saw her gravestone, Breed Malone, she was from the Malone family, who were a well-known Dublin Republican family. And the gravestone simply says, Breed, Breen, Ní Malone, Cumann Amán, in brackets, active.
Yes.
And it's a statement from the grave. And this question that arose about what constituted active service. And there are all sorts of disputes about how you might interpret that. But you do then begin to branch out in relation to what people found themselves doing. And like we refer to the democratization of the archives and the digitization and the access that people have and the personal connections that they can make. These aren't household names, you know. This is one of the great values. And you can even see that in how official remembrance was shifting, in that 1966 you would have had stamps, you know, the signatories of the proclamation. Whereas now, you know, you would have a woman in Cumann na Mban, you would have a labourer, you would have, I think, Sean Foster, who was the youngest victim in 1916, he was just a 2-year-old. And even to talk about the children.
Yes, indeed.
And the children.
Could we pause on that a minute, just for one thing that occurred to me, that democratization of access and archive and the sheer proliferation of serious investigative work and of people that are now accessing the archive. I think the Decade was fortunate that that wave was already on the rise. If you look at the developments, let us say since at the turn of the century, and you can see changes coming about, not just life writing and the increased confessional thing, but also consciousness of the importance of memory for all sorts of reasons, because of dementia, because of the neurological thing, because of memory as a condition and memory as a cultural construct. That was already exciting greater curiosity. And then, of course, the online availability of the censuses was a critical breakthrough. It initiated people into doing the most intimate research at a familial level. And therefore individual stories became available, or the possibility of constructing intergenerational narratives, making inquiries. And there was a huge impetus to that kind of thing. Now, the downside of which I'll come to in a minute, but the upside of it is that by the time that archive and the different archives became available, the pension one is the big load, the Klondike, but also it would be no harm to mention that the compilation of lists in a systematic way, Herlihy stuff on the RIC, Langan stuff, the most recent stuff on the falling of the Civil War, the compilation by Ewan O'Halpin and O'Corrine of the dead of the Irish Revolution, the availability in a form of databases that are now well researched and that are reliable to add to prompt, to assist. All of that has been part of the general democratization, and even as we say, of inquiry.
I mean, a project like the Dead of the Revolution, that's the fruit of decades of research. You can't do a book like that quickly. And the more and more sources that became available, the more cross-checking that you have to do as well. And, you know, that's hard work. It needs time and it needs funding. But it also allows you to question some of your assumptions about how people died. Because, I mean, we're also dealing with a decade where a lot of people were killed. There are horror stories. There is terrible pain inflicted and endured. But you also get a very strong sense of the civilian experience. 39% of the deaths that were recorded by O'Corrine and O'Halpin were civilians between January 1917
summer of 22.
and up to summer 21.
39%
civilians. And even, you know, drilling down further, we might think a lot about the ambushes of the War of Independence, you know, classic motif of the War of Independence ambush. That's not how most people...
the ricochet bullet, the person shot on the bicycle. All of these things.
But you're right about memory, and even memory studies, and I know that's something that you would have looked at
hugely
in different contexts.
You were one of the earliest in on the idea of memory and commemoration and where it was, but it was a burgeoning thing across all disciplines, and none. It was simply because human people were becoming more aware of the living and what it meant and memory. And I think
it brings us back to, and it's an important thing to recouple into this, if you like. I mean, the decade started really looking at Home Rule. It started with the volunteers. It then, obviously, in a very clear way, engaged with the First World War. Which in a way is really where the sort of memory studies thing kind of blossomed out of that.
It was,
And I think what fed into then, I think, and the pensions really picks up on it, is why it becomes easier for us to think and write about, for want of a better word, ordinary people in the past. More people are more interested in ordinary people. And I think that's linked in ways to the First World War, because that really, I suppose, got people thinking about who were these young men who went various different fronts all over the world. What were their experiences? It took us down away from the great men, if you like, and thinking more about, well, who were these people? What were the effects it had on them? And that has fed through. I think in some ways through the decade, as the decade has gone on, we have kind of uncoupled it. The First World War has been sort of left over there a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think we need to sort of keep it in mind, because I think it had a huge effect on thinking about the complex decisions people in the past made. And that again reinforces the shift away from, as you said, the men and the stamps in 1966.
Yeah.
Because for somehow we assume their decisions were more easily made. Maybe they weren't.
Yeah.
But I think once you start to take it into, I suppose, an area that's as well encouraged by people being more interested in genealogy and being able to do that in their front room through the kind of digital sources that are now available to them. But people are much more, I think, inclined to say, well, okay, I found so-and-so who was joined the British Army in 1915, and then he's on the anti-treaty side in 1923. How did that happen? Or alternatively, I'm kind of struck by the work of someone like that Brian Hughes is doing at the moment, and looking at people who were active in various different shapes and forms in maybe the War of Independence, and then suddenly said, you know what, middle of 1920, I can't do this anymore. I need to stop. I need to stop, because basically my father has died and nobody else is there to keep the family going. That idea of activism and why and how people became active really starts to expose, well, people make decisions sometimes for very mundane reasons.
Well, this foregrounding of the quotidian, as it were, and of everyday
And you can see it in their wills.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, the
and
wills,
complexity.
the bareness of them.
Yeah.
You know, and they're available in the National Archives, where these young soldiers are going to the front, and what will happen in the event of their death, what they will believe
But
behind.
if you think, like, I mean, some of the military service pensions, I've found a few wills in some of them, and you're sort of seeing these connections that were made in 1922. The executor of somebody's will in the 1970s is the person they would have met in the volunteers.
We want to go on and say something about the formal public commemoration and what it tells us about the public as a whole, as it were. Not so much what they've learned as how the events of the decade were represented to them and were presented to them. Before that, maybe just a little devil's advocate that we'll come back to before the end. One of the consequences of the new emphasis on the everyday, on the menu peuple, the small people, on the personal stories, the life stories, and so on, and the sheer proliferation of accounts, and the sheer proliferation of local studies, all of them informed by good sources, or at least a lot of them, all of them demanding attention, 24 hours in the day, and so on. What is the answer to the suggestion or the charge that we have, in doing that, essentially eclipsed the notion of ideology, the abstractions, any idea of a grand narrative? Now, I'm not talking about the grand narrative of 1966, or the heroic moment of 1916, followed by the David and Goliath of the War of Independence, where the might of the army are beaten by the boys of Barnesrode. You know, they're the simple narratives. But what I'm saying is, generally speaking, where is the overarching idea? Is there a need for, or are we well rid of, what was an incarcerating set of meta-narratives, whether it was colonialism, anti-imperialism, nationalism, that once we've now begun to dig down and look around and so on and so forth, that none of these fit. That, in other words, the idea that we can't see the wood for the trees, it's because there's no wood. You know what I mean? Essentially, at least there's not. The wood is like, it's a bit like Macbeth's wood. It's on the move all the time. And therefore, there's no point in saying that we can't see the wood, because there's no grand narrative within which we can now feel comfortably at ease. Nonetheless, surely, if we're trying to think of a mindset of why people went out thinking they were shooting because of something called a republic, and that the abstraction was so mesmerizing, surely perhaps we need to give a little bit more attention than be utterly absorbed in whether the grandfather or the granduncle had 2 or 3 different things before the pension application. What would you say to that? That's devil's advocate now, I'm not...
I think that will come in time, for precisely the reason that you're talking about, because it will get to a stage where people will recognise that to make this accessible and intelligible, and for ourselves, that we do need to go back to some sense of an overall picture. The ideological formation of that generation. I found it fascinating in 2016 that there was so little reference to religion. And I remember it being part of a panel that was discussing the proclamation. And it was excluded from the conversation. And you had to remind people that the opening words of the proclamation were in the name of God.
And of the dead generation.
And people were almost talking about the proclamation as a secular document. And the point I was making is that we need to understand the intense religiosity of that generation and what their formation was under all sorts of different headings to get a sense of what drove them. And we need that in a broader sense as well, to be able to put schmucked on it, you know, because it's fantastic to have such a proliferation of material, but it's also overwhelming. It does need to be mediated, and part of that mediation process, I think, does need to involve a grand narrative. But I think that will come in time.
Yeah, I mean, I was struck by, I think it was in the Atlas of the Irish Revolution, Dave Fitzpatrick wrote a piece about local history. Obviously, he was one of the first out there with his great history of Clare. And the undertone of the essay was basically, well, okay, there's all this new local history and it's great, but what's the point of it all? Where's it going?
Yeah.
What do we do with it? What's the ultimate aim? And I think you're right, this is going to take a bit more time. This is why, if you like, the decade is coming to an end, but the work is going to have to keep going. Maybe unlike the bicentenary of 1798, where you got that feeling the work just came to a stop. What was there left to say? I think actually by approaching it in the way that we have, has meant much more work now needs to be done. But also I think by approaching it the way that we have, I think it's echoing your point. You're making it easier for people to engage with actually those big questions through the decisions of the individual or through the decisions of people in a very particular locality at a particular time. I mean, I was, again, struck by the point you said there about religion. I mean, one of the privileges I had over the period was myself and William Murphy, we got to look at Collins's diaries when they came out first. And we got to write about them. And one of the things that was really striking in it was how many priests' names were in there, in terms of the priests were such an important part of channeling money up to them. And just the degree to which, why have we closed out certain things? Why have we introduced other? And again, it's always about...
It's about now.
It is.
About now.
And also we have to, I suppose, at least entertain the possibility that it's part of a wider malaise, if one can call it a malaise, or a wider condition of a suspicion of imposed coherence. Ideologically, generally, it's not an Irish thing particularly, but a suspicion of imposed coherence where voices had to be suppressed in order to allow it, or in order for it to be functioning. You know, and I think that probably that we're not anxious to have a reimposed coherence. I think you're probably right as a matter of time. Could I bounce off? Sorry,
I
yes.
think I was struck by the fact that we had no kind of Simon Schama type history of, his history of Britain, where this one voice came on the television week after week after week.
The voice of God.
Yeah, exactly. This overarching one voice. I think a lot of the television stuff was very much talking heads, different perspectives.
Well, we had it earlier with Robert Key.
Yeah, that's true.
We had the Gladstonian narrative of Ireland, a la Ireland 1966.
So we did have a bit of it
with all the great and good we did, but we didn't. No, we didn't.
We had Liam Neeson, primarily for an American audience, really, coming out of Notre Dame and those kind of.
Yeah, but it didn't have the authority of these official narratives that were, or the sham.
If you think of it as well, like we've had generations of people now who have been through a secondary school system. If they've done history, they're getting it through this kind of multi-perspective approach. They're getting this idea of there is no one voice, there is no one way to do it.
But they're getting a lot of them the idea that there's no history either because they're not being taught it.
But
that's a different dilemma.
And that was part of the debate.
But now that we've come to the great unwashed, as it were, let's pause for a moment. How over the decade, in terms of the public history, from official state history, events, as it were, the official state commemoration, the event, and I suppose, but for the want of just get a shorthand on it, we would see as state events at which members of the defence forces were permitted to be in attendance. Essentially, everything else, though it may well have had a formal benediction, including events organised by the Untuchtaran, for example, with his own set of reflections, the Machn series and so on. But events that had members of the defence forces in attendance have an imprimatur in terms of public commemoration. And that's with the sensitive, if you like, calendar of the decade. What impressions has it left you with? I mean, the forms of public commemoration, from the set-piece events right down to theatre and film and monuments and commissioned works and whatever. What at the end of it all, both of you, what's the abiding sense of it?
The pride was palpable in a way that was of its time. And this is also post-peace process commemoration. the road to the rising. There was kind of the dry run, you know, in which there was a great sense of public participation, but also pride and celebration. And of course, historians would have been very sniffy about the idea. This is not about celebration. This is about commemoration. But, you know, it's not for us to impose this framework or this feeling that people should have. There was an extraordinary dynamism at local level, and local community projects, and local libraries did a brilliant job, and people researching their own family history. So that was a very important strand of it. But when it comes to the Defence Forces and the formality, the solemn occasions, the Irish Army does that. They do those events very, very well. And it's a reminder too of the seriousness of it and what it led to. But you also then have I suppose the cultural representations, the immersions. The new productions really stood out for me. Louise Lowe's and New Productions, the theatre company that drew people into particular scenarios, Living the Lockout, or Pals, which was a terrific play. I don't know if you saw that on, based on those who formed Pals brigades to go out and fight in the First World War. And there's a very strong social history stitched into a lot of these as well. But there was also inevitably a temptation to impose current day values or priorities on the dramatisation. So if you have a drama about the rising, in some cases women were given a prominence or a profile that they wouldn't necessarily have had at the time, but it's almost a form of compensation or recompense, and it's also speaking to the now. But you also had writers, novelists, Sebastian Barry, and again this predates the actual decade of commemoration, talking about rescuing characters from what he called the cold hand of history, and those who were left to their dreadful wounds and their hideous asylums, and again, you know, going back to that sense of betrayal. So it really is it's quite a mix. Like, there was an acceptance. There was an architecture around state commemoration, and a realism about how many events you could actually commemorate or should commemorate. This wasn't about going out and sending the army down to every part of the country to commemorate particular ambushes or atrocities. It was more about being selective about the particular events that required a state commemoration. And there was the advisory group that we all had some involvement in as well, who were there to advise. And I mean, they've no monopoly on wisdom or virtue when it comes to this either. And there were complications. And let's not forget that even before the plan was unveiled, there was a very long wait for it. And then they got the tone wrong in relation to Ireland inspires, which led to a lot of justifiable derision.
Indeed.
You know? So it's not that it was plain sailing.
Journalists perspired, I think, when they got that particular handout. I want to raise a few sore thumbs, but I want to end, first of all, there's a few sore thumbs in this that I want to love.
I mean, I think at the same time there was an expectation that the state had to do formal things at very particular points, and they definitely did do them, and there would have been, I think, disappointment if they hadn't have done them. I was struck by that event in the National Concert Hall for the Civil War in a way which maybe didn't strike the tone that was maybe expected, and something else needed to be done. That, you know, you could see these things that sort of had to right themselves.
Civil War was always going to be more tricky.
Yeah, but I mean, I was struck by the things like, you know, the importance that was given to the treaty for the first time. I mean, in a way, 1916 had a dry run with the 50th anniversary, for want of a better way of putting it. You didn't have that with 1919 to 23. For the 50th. You didn't get that sort of intense engagement with it for the 50th anniversary that you had for 1916. So I was really struck and kind of really encouraged by what happened about the treaty, both, as you say, in terms of drama around it. There was, I think, you know, an evening in the National Concert Hall with songs about the treaty. You know, so you had something that, in a way, was this incredibly difficult document, put front and centre and said, look at this hard thing. Think about it. Look at the pressure that went on. That exhibition went to the National Ploughing Championship. So you had massive public engagement with this thing in a way that I don't think I'd ever remembered before. I think there was a suggestion at one point. Cumann Gael had made a suggestion in the 20s that let's have a day of independence on the 6th of December. It, you know, just dead, died a death. But in a way, those things were kind of out there and thought about. In a way, the politics of the period, I think, in a way. Activism that amounted to activism outside and beyond, Cumann Amon, the Irish Volunteers, was thought about. Okay. I mean,
problematic ones. All right.
And the constitutional leaders got
but let's pick a few tricky ones. Let's pick a few sore thumbs and see why effectively we reached the point. If we take it that the purpose of this from a state, if you like, welfare point of view, not from the advisory group or anything, was to try and reach peak consensual and therefore peak consent. When was it reached? All right. The wall in Glasnevin and the controversy. The non-show at Solihull Beg for the start of what was sanctioned or not sanctioned, the military aspect of the War of Independence, and whatever valorization of the freedom fight was, it was not going to be marked down in Solihull Beg. Charlie Flanagan's suggestion about the RIC event, and it ended up as a religious event in St. Paul's Cathedral in England 2 years later. The controversy about the Armagh event and partition. And I'm not going to, this isn't whataboutery, but these are interesting because they indicate the limit of something or other. And what do they indicate the limit of? Why did they strike a bum note? Is there any general comment we can make about them?
I think it goes back to your point about what people thought commemoration was, because in a way, in 2016 there was that moment, and you heard it in people giving interviews, and the word commemoration slipped into celebration almost without them knowing it. Yeah. And if you think about the kind of things that happened in that very concentrated week in 2016, what it reflected back on was a period of men and some women largely in uniform facing men in uniform. What obviously happens at Solihull Beg and thereafter is very, very different. So the type of violence is different, which makes it hard. Okay, we know that. What struck me about it, though, is that we didn't really maybe engage enough with what does the word commemoration mean, or what can it potentially mean for people. Because if it means celebration, then some of those things that you mentioned become very difficult. If it means marking something or acknowledging it happened, then maybe it's an easier thing to look at some of those different events. I think what also is a problem about it, or why these things became problematic, was that it looked like the state, which has its origins in very particular places, it's not a wholly neutral actor in this either. It has to acknowledge where its origins came from. But the wall in Glasnevin, even though it was a Glasnevin initiative, Enda Kenny was there for the opening of the first part of it. There were the moments that you talk about were moments when it looked like the state was doing that commemorative thing to some people as if they were honouring as opposed to just acknowledging. I think maybe that's where and it comes back to a failure to engage with what the hell do we actually mean by
and there are
this
limits
tricky word
to
commemoration.
Shared history. You know?
Yes,
take the language of the peace process. I remember looking at David Cameron when he was British Prime Minister, and Enda Kenny when he was Taoiseach, and they were walking the fields of Flanders, and there was a sense, we've grown up now, we can look at this together. And there was constant reference to shared history and different memories, which is far too neat a bow. There are limits to that, and Brian Hanley was quite vocal about this, the historian, during the decade, that can ignore big problematic questions of imperialism and power, and some of those issues that you have raised. I remember Eamon Gilmore when he was Taoiseach in 2014. I think he was over Cambridge and suggested that a royal presence in Dublin in 2016 would be a good idea, and it wasn't a good idea. And the point that had to be made was that there's no point in trying to contrive a consensus too far that ignores the reality of the divisiveness of these events. There was a reason why these events happened, And then with what I found fascinating, Charlie Flanagan had quite a history here, and he took it very seriously. I remember Ronan Fanning, the late Ronan Fanning, the historian, taking him on and saying, we have to have a shameless celebration of 2016. And Flanagan was making the point that, well, no, we don't want to offend people, and we have to be very, very careful. And then when it came to, the RIC controversy, there was this issue of a Minister for Justice of a state that came into existence largely as a result of Republican violence, wanting to take the commemoration of the RIC, and it wasn't thought out properly, and it was a bit of a solo run by the Department of Justice. But the RIC was not just about the RIC. The RIC was also, as we know, about the auxiliaries, the black and tans, and it became then... It came in the context of a changed political environment.
Well, I was coming to that because I think that, and you were mentioning the morphing of commemoration and celebration. I'm not altogether convinced that is the distinction. I think it's a chronological thing. I think things were manageable up to 2016. Not only because the First World War was a shared experience. After all, it was a single state, and you could attribute any motives to the recruitment. They were going for home rule. They were following John Redmond, whatever the case may be. But of course, 2016 is Brexit.
Yeah.
And what effectively Brexit, if you actually talk about the overall climate within which imagining the past, dealing with the present, finding ways to reach consensus, whether it is Cameron and Enda or whatever.
Yeah.
What you get is that there is an almost, there's an exorbitant amity in Anglo-Irish relations in that run-up. Thanks to the EU, thanks to royal visits, reciprocal this and that and the others, and the shared history idea, so that effectively the July of 2016 could be the aftermath of the Rising, but the Somme, and there was no problem with it.
Yeah.
There was, and the second thing to remember is that at this stage, Sinn Féin had identified an electoral advantage for themselves. And there was no question of Sinn Féin trying to organise a parallel and disruptive set of commemorations up to that point, and after indeed. So what you get, when you come, the RSE are a different category to the army up to 1916, to the British Army stuff and the shared histories and so on and so forth, because you're prefiguring almost civil war. In that particular thing, and it's a messy one, and it's you can't get out of it. But could I? I'm keeping an eye on the clock, and I want to leave some time for the audience to pitch in with questions. But before we more or less take a pause on this, Northern Ireland, their commemoration, they had a decade of centenaries. And the critical part for their decade of centenary is don't always align with the key moments in which we have to either congratulate ourselves or take stock. A thing that did strike me very often, and you correct me if I'm wrong on this, I think there is only one to date detailed local study of the innards of the loyalist paramilitaries of the specialists, the most recent one by McGill on northeast Ulster, that you could put alongside Peter Hart, or you could put alongside a full shelf of studies of the social composition of the volunteers, the levels of atrocity or what, motivation. The paucity of an equivalent excavation at local level within loyalism is, to me at least, absolutely striking. What, do you find the same?
I mean, I was struck. I mean, I think there's work being done at the moment. I know this through being involved in the Royal Irish Academy is now the Aim and Phoenix Bursary for local history, and there is some work being done. Patrick Mulrow is doing work in that kind of vein. So I mean, there is that work being done. I mean, there's an issue of scale as well. There's not as many people working on the period there, so we have to give that point. I mean, I think there's certainly big issues and big political issues, and you could see it in terms of the minute political parties became involved in anything to do with commemoration in Northern Ireland became very, very tricky indeed. What I think we're missing is that a lot of local work was going on. There was a really excellent conference in Monaghan. A lot of interesting stuff been done about the border, but again, striking how long it took for books about partition to be written.
Yep.
I mean, you've written about the border, but how long did it take that book by Charles Townsend to come out in partition? Robert Lynch. It's taken 100 years really to get there. I mean, it's great that the Boundary Commission material has been made available by the National Archives in London. It's
look at
good that Proney is working with.
But look at the bibliographies or the primary sources, for example, of the forecourt history, county history ones that have been.
No, you're right about you're right about the loyalist paramilitaries, and I mean, I found it very interesting that the work of Tim Bowman, who wrote about the Army Air Force,
correct,
that was reissued, whereas you would have expected it to be updated.
And superseded.
And some of the fascinating material that came out of that is, what about the social basis of loyalist paramilitaries, which was much wider. What about the age profile, because they're an older force than the IRA, can we start to make comparisons there, but also the dynamics at local level, because obviously, no more than ourselves, when it comes to the construction of narratives, the narrative that was constructed about the heroic UGF, the reality was much more complex, and we needed to hear a lot more about that. But it also then merged with a great sense of insecurity on the part of loyalists about their own history and what they were facing now. And again, Brexit was relevant there. You mentioned the border. I mean, I wrote a book in anger. When you have the likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson making pronouncements on Irish history, like the great tragedy of the decade really is that we ended up as a divided island, and I think an opportunity was missed there to do more excavation in those areas and to try and figure out local dynamics within loyalism, because it is so layered,
I think Brexit, though, has upended so much because of the immediate polarization, the question, the possibilities even of finding an agenda around which a civilized
But it also
discussion
raised the relation
of the origins of the northern state.
But it also raised that age-old issue of the relationship between Unionists and a Tory
Oh
government.
yes, absolutely.
And, you know, and the way in which what became the most intractable issue was almost completely ignored during the referendum campaign, or was dismissed as an irrelevant.
But I think as well, you have to think of it in terms of, yes, you can look at Brexit, but you also have to look at the personalities that Brexit threw up.
Yeah.
So in a way, it's thinking about, yes, the fact that it's Boris Johnson, the fact that, if you like, the equivalent of the expert advisory group here in Britain kind of stopped in 2018.
Yes.
They had very few historians on it. They, you know, in a way, that interest in history, and in a way, one of the real issues around this is lack of thought about how, you know, what did all this period actually do to British history, never mind what happened on this island, but thinking of it also in terms of the other anniversaries that started to arise, if you like, layered on top of the 100th anniversaries, whether it be the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, but also we're starting to hit 50th anniversaries of things that happened during the Troubles. So we, you know, we have to, you have to think about this in terms of layering things
in fairness,
on.
lest it should be said, the BBC Northern Ireland did a good job in consultation with Queen's in having a series of very good and informative events. And if we're I'm thinking of your verbs keeps on coming back at me, and what Brexit threw up. But I'm sure you meant it in the most casual way.
I did, yeah, sorry.
One of the things that might be worth mentioning was the effort that was made, and it was a blast from the past in terms of the political disposition that informed it, was Portillo's programmes. Whatever one might think about them, there was a scruple for evidence there. There was an attempt to empathise, and there was an historical sense that wasn't polemicised or wasn't opportunist.
Maybe a bit too much effort to empathise.
Maybe so, Diarmaid, but...
No, I take the point. I take the point you're making, but it was also about getting an insight into the formation of Britain's Irish politics.
Oh, yes.
You know, Portillo did drill down.
Oh, he did, of course. Well, you should expect that from a student of Maurice Cowling's.
Well, there you go. But I remember being in the archive at Westminster when I was working on the border and going through the correspondence of David Lloyd George when he was Prime Minister and Winston Churchill when he was Secretary of State for the Colonies. And again, no more than you've said about whatever you think about them, the seriousness with which they conducted the business of politics. And I was in there at the time when Johnson was being hauled over the Supreme Court coals for proroguing Parliament illegally. And you know, you start to see how the winds of, you know, current affairs and history are colliding. And that was part of it. But, you know, there was that, I suppose, attempt to understand the minds that are saturated with imperialism and the consequences of that. And it wasn't just about Ireland. When you were looking through the correspondence during that period, they're also concerned about Greece and they're concerned about Palestine.
And India.
The map. The map that we talked about a few years ago when David Lloyd George brought Eamon de Valera in and said, this is our empire. You can be part of this, you know.
Now I'm going to give an opportunity for some questions and so on. It's going to be limited because of the nature of these events. They only last, as it were, 60 minutes plus, topping and well, we will take the extra 5 minutes at the end, Catriona. So, but we'll open it for the moment and see if there are comments or questions that anybody would like to come in with now, please, for a few moments. And there is a roving mic here to the right.
Can I just say one thing before, like, we're thinking of a question?
Please.
I think we haven't mentioned the lockdowns and COVID.
No.
And the degree to which it really showed that commemoration is a very communal thing in time, and particularly for those official ones. And just the degree to which, I mean, to what extent did it make people think about the past in a different way, in the sense of people were losing loved ones, they were thinking about loss and remembrance and all of those things. I think it's a really important factor to bear in mind.
Yes. How
much or how little. We don't know, we're not going to know.
No, I think that's absolutely true.
And some may have felt it took a bit of the heat out of commemoration in Northern Ireland.
Yes. There's over here to the left, I think there's do I see a love and order? I do, I think.
Thank you very much. The panel mentioned theatre earlier on, and I'm just wondering, what's your reaction to how we commemorated through public art and monument the centenary? My own sense is a bit underwhelmed, but maybe I wasn't paying attention just to how do the public arts and artists respond?
I mean, I think it's been key in terms of, you can see just in terms of local authorities that I think at one point there was an obligation that they had to sort of spend something like 15,000 a year on creative responses to it. So there's certainly been very considerable efforts and very considerable sort of work done. Sometimes it felt maybe that the reaction was too Dublin based, but then at the same time there was a lot happening locally that, you know, I don't think any of us could have kept up with how much was happening locally. Whether it's adequate or not, I don't know. That's very much in the eye of the beholder. I mean, it struck me when you were talking about sort of creative reactions to this. It can be hugely important. I mean, I keep going back to the idea in my head of Frank O'Connor's Guest of the Nation. And the degree to which he was able to write things and ask questions of the period in, what was it, 1931, I think, first. He was able to ask questions that caused and it took so long for historians to ask those big questions. And he was able to do that 10 years after, if you like, the treaty.
No more than O'Casey being able to write even before that about what this meant or didn't mean for the people that he was interested in.
Just that idea of a space where someone can react creatively, and it allows people to have a conversation that when historians have that conversation, it could become quite dogmatic very quickly. And there's a huge importance in that, whether it's good art or bad art, I'm not qualified to say, but it's important.
The artist Owen McLaughlin launched an exhibition there to commemorate the centenary of the Civil War, which involves sketching over 1,500 charcoal faces to represent the dead of the Civil War. And that illuminates that individual labour that went in, you know, for a very personal response. This is how I, as an artist, I'm choosing to do this. There were bursaries available as well. There were some people who were able to organise artistic projects at local levels. You had writers in residence in some of the local authorities as well. But, you know, in relation to the art world, maybe not as big of a splash.
No, one would, I'm open to correction. I was looking to see where they're commissioned musical, apart from the actual musical events, symphony orchestra, you know, the set piece things. Funnily enough, just to answer your question on being underwhelmed, I do think that the point Anne made of the way in which COVID shut down so much, and we're probably seeing after the Druid O'Casey at the moment, for example, there were revivals in different places of McGuinness's Sons of Ulster, so that it wasn't a question of it being ignored, but there was no theatrical detonation, as it were, even in the early part of the commemoration that I can recall. The part of it that I was most intrigued by is that how little the 1913 event resonated. Now, there were very worthy publications, and Padraig Yates did a good deal in Dublin and so on and so forth. But when you think that in 2013, we were still in the absolute horrors of the greatest crisis of finance capitalism that had hit, as it were, since the Second World War. And I'd be more than happy to sponsor for a €5 card the number who can say they were at an event commemorating Jim Larkin. Katrina Crowe is going to beggar me, I can see that. But if you look generally, I mean, there's very little that resonated.
Well, there were events in Liberty Hall.
There were,
I mean, Padraig Yates did us all a great service in his Dublin trilogy.
Yes.
You know, the history of Dublin throughout the decade. It was a marvellous feat of scholarship. Interestingly, the 1913 commemorations did merge with that crisis that you're talking about. And it was invoked in that context, but more in the context of contemporary politics.
It was, and indeed, and in fact, the way it was internalized into a dominant rhetoric was not, this is a crisis of capitalism, we need to change the world. It was, we'll get into office and get our economic sovereignty back and see the Troika leaving whatever hotel they were in, and that was our moment of liberation.
That would be the Marion.
That was the Spike Island moment, as it were, for the Irish bourgeoisie.
I mean, wasn't there,
I mean, it is a very extraordinary thing.
There was that quilt, you know, that big
tapestry.
Yes.
But I mean, I remember I had a student recently who wanted to do some work on it, and we were trying to very, poor results. Where is it now?
The Troika took that with them.
Still on display, exactly. Why isn't it still part of? Why isn't it in a gallery somewhere? Where is it now?
Yeah.
But I mean, this is it didn't. I don't think it set the world alight. But I mean, there was a really interesting dramatisation of the minutes of the Constitution Committee.
Yes.
And I say this from experience of trying to get students to read the minutes of the Constitution Committee and failing year after year after year. Every single one of them watched that, and they came in the next day going, yeah, this is really important stuff, isn't it? What we were kind of, what? It just brought to light, you know, it may not have had a big, it made a big impression, but there were moments that people really did engage with, and they got it because it was creative, because it appealed to them on that
It had the
level.
dramatic, Are there any other interventions before we... do I see? Oh, yes, sorry, here.
Hello.
Yes, yes.
Okay, myself?
Yes, yourself.
Thanks. Thanks, I enjoyed the talk.
Well, there's a mic on its way to you.
Yeah, thanks very much for the talk so far. I didn't study history at secondary school, so I took an interest in it a bit later and over the decade. Certain things stand out, a bit controversial perhaps, is that I did ask questions because of my background, I suppose, and is about the border and partition in 2015, early 2016. And there was a deep and great reluctance to respond to it. Obviously, when Brexit happened, that completely and utterly changed. That's just interesting. In terms of the other thing is the violence, I'd have a deep questioning in hindsight, and that's very important to say, in hindsight of the whole project. I would say, and this is very controversial, even from 1798 onwards, pretty much every revolutionary rising with violence made a bad situation much worse. Difficult, and I don't think that was really, you know, brought out or that aspect of the violence in the decade. There was, we'd say, about Redmond and Home Rule and so on. I don't think that's sufficient. I think that just touched the surface of what's going on. I concur as well with Diarmaid in relation to religion. The famine and the aftermath of that, the devotional revolution and so on, but it really goes back to the Reformation and most of the Irish at the time's choice to stay Catholic rather than go with the king and become Protestant. That, to me, had a pivotal effect. Last thing, mention about the arts, the Banshees. Did you go and did you find it interesting?
The Banshees.
The Banshees of Inisherin.
Yes.
Oh, I did. No, I went. I didn't necessarily go just as a historian, but I thought it was slightly overhyped. Now, I was intrigued at the idea of there being a beer garden on an island 100 years ago, but.
Well,
but Gearoid apparently knows more about that.
But Tom Flanagan had not only beer in Mayo in 1798 in his novel, which there wasn't, but he had Belmullet, which there wasn't. So there must be some license allowed.
But in relation to violence, it's a huge question, obviously. And I remember one of the books that was published during the decade was Ronan Fanning's Fatal Path.
That's right, yeah.
Which is again about the Irish policy of the British government. But the thesis in that book was that violence worked. And the argument he was making was that it moved Britain beyond the meanness of the proposed Home Rule solution to something more substantial, and that the only way to achieve that was through violence. Now, Ronan Fanning would not have published that book in the 1970s or the 1980s or the 1990s. So there's an interesting contemporary influence on how these questions about violence are framed, and the wider context there of British violence and British imperialism as well. But you're always going to have that argument that what was ultimately achieved, incomplete as it was, unsatisfactory as it was for many, some would make the argument that could have been achieved peacefully. Others will trenchantly disagree. But I don't think you're going to find a consensus on that. And we don't want to find too much consensus either.
No,
And I'm going to wrap up in a moment, but maybe about 3 minutes, and we'll have our own comments as a final one as to what we think.
I mean, I think one of the things, the violence of the whole thing, I think, has really opened up in more recent years, partly out of a frustration maybe with some of the heat and light in debates around violence in the period in the 90s. I think it's become a much more reasonable debate, not least because we're starting to ask different questions of the use of violence in the period. One of the things that struck me about, say, the Dead of the Revolution is that, yes, it documents every single person who died up to the end of 1921, but when you look at it in a wider comparative perspective, this place could have been a lot more violent, and it wasn't. And we have to remember that our Civil War could have been a lot more violent than it was, which is not to downplay the extent of the violence or the loss of any individual who did die. But when you look at this place comparatively, we had a relatively, contained amount of violence and a quite strategic use of violence in some respects. And you can even see that when you look at the British records, in the sense that they did not use bombs from the air in this place as they were in other parts of the world at the same time. There's really interesting things about the relationship between this island and the next in terms of what the violence in the period can tell you. But I think we do have to remember that although all that listing of dead people, in a way, one of the kind of, maybe it seems an unpleasant thing to say out of it, but there might have been an awful lot more, given the capacity for it.
Could I have a final comment from you, Diarmaid, and then we'll probably see if we can find something.
In relation to the scale of the violence?
No, and more generally, looking back now, I'd ask both of you, just looking back now.
Anna's just alluded to something there that's going to become more and more important, and it's been termed now the global Irish Revolution.
Yes.
Where do we fit in? What's the comparative context? And, we have to think about this in a much broader framework. What did the First World War do? And you also need to look, I suppose, at the successful side of that. In that the successful states, the states that came out of the wreckage of the First World War, we did pretty well by comparison with others.
Well, I was just on that comparative, with a good note on which to finish, that we probably, when the dust has settled on this, and we begin to see kind of a compte rendu of what it is that we had left out, or more particularly what might have been emphasised more, a comparative framework would be one of the big ones. And you alluded it, both of you have remarked on the comparisons that have been made. I'm reminded of two things. Firstly, and it's 60 years old now, the first estimates that were made, I think John Roberts, the historian, made them, of the minorities who were left, as it was put, on the wrong side of borders after the First World War between 1919 and 23. The figure was 60-something million. Large numbers of them, millions of them, left contiguous to the state to which they felt culturally and in every other sense that they belonged. So that there were the Churchill comment about the dreary steeples of Fermanagh and Tyrone being unique. There were Fermanaghs and Tyrones and Crossmaglen's all the way.
And much bigger ones.
Bigger ones, and more lethal from the Baltic to the Balkans. The second thing is that particularly the military the effort from 1919 up to 23, and indeed its aftermath, worth looking at it in the context of the Horn and Gevert study of the war after war. In other words, the whole series of conflicts that run from 1919 to 24, and to look at that one rather than in the long continuum from the
They're the
Fenians.
wars that Churchill dismissed as the wars of the pygmies.
That's right. Yeah. So there is a comparative dimension, I think, that we do need to probably attend to more. We're going to wrap it up. First of all, may I thank my colleagues. We are blessed with having a young generation of historians in their prime now, and I say young, though Anne is insisting on putting age in herself. But the generation that are now in their prime have done incredible work. You spoke about you've changed some of your perspectives and nuances over the course of your own lifetime as a historian. I attended the lectures for the 1966 commemoration, and the state of historiography at the time, and look at the best that was published at the time, the collections of essays, the Thomas Davis theories and so on, and look at the sources that were available, and look at what has become available and what's available. But there's no point in having sources unless there are those who do the work, who give the insights, and we're blessed with the current generation of historians. Three things I leave you with to think about if you want to be doing your own little looking out for markers about what the Decade of Centenaries may have left us with here, the engagement. Firstly, keep a close eye to the implications of Béal na Blá and that choreography of reconciliation, when an effort has to be made within the next 18 months or so to differentiate Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael as both go chasing the votes and try to find a way of differentiating between themselves. That moment in Béal na Blá with the refurbished monument there was more than the monument refurbished. And if you look at it, you will see that's one thing to be looking out for, into seeing what exactly have we been left with. The second thing is, and Diarmaid will be talking about this later today, neutrality. The terms in which the neutrality thing is now going to be talked about will at least give some pointers as to what the residuum, or at least the legacy of the last decade of discussions about Ireland, place in the world, what we are, what does sovereignty mean, all of these things. That will come out, will be teased out, and so on and so forth, fairly trickily. There are things to watch out for, I think, if we want to see how, as it were, the Decade of Centenaries has left us. Because even those who haven't been following it as history nerds, or who haven't been, if you like, overwhelmed by it as a public spectacle, cannot have escaped the fact that the terms of the debate and of what's that awful thing, the national conversation, the terms of the debate will have been affected by it. And if we look out for that, we'll probably find, as Katrina said, that there will be more anniversaries coming along. I'm minded of the president of a university, not this one, who was exasperated at the fact that graduates kept on traipsing across the lawn of his residence in a city further south. And his wife was even more exasperated. And every time that he had brought a proposal to the academic council to change anything in the university, it was poo-pooed immediately on the grounds that we do it this way because of tradition. And the story is that on one Sunday afternoon, the lady of the house came out and left a large poster in the front garden where the students had made their shortcut, saying, "There will be no walking on this grass by a tradition beginning next Monday." So Katrina Crowe will have traditions beginning next year. Thank you very much for attending, folks.
Aren't we incredibly lucky to have Gearoid O'Tuig? We truly are. His eloquence and his wit and the breadth of his knowledge is extraordinary. And of my two great friends, Diarmaid and Anne, who have given us a fantastic tour of what's gone on over the last 12 years. Now, I've got good news for you all. Anne mentioned the treaty and the prominence that it achieved finally during this decade, that people started to look at the most important conversation in many ways we ever had with ourselves. And new productions, to whom Diarmaid alluded, produce the treaty debates in the words of those who took part in the National Concert Hall, then Earlsfort Terrace, the university where the original debates actually took place. The room where they took place was restored to its original splendour. Everybody was cast magnificently. The 12 days or so of the actual debates were reduced to 4 evenings, and it was magnificent. Unfortunately, nobody from the Irish Times Theatre Awards saw fit to go and see it, so they couldn't be nominated for an award. But they were clever enough to film it, and to film it very, very well. So what you have to look forward to later this year is that the Irish Film Institute is going to show the movie, which is 10 hours long. This is our fantastic tribute to the whole business of proper democratic discussion in the middle of all the turmoil. And then it's going to go on the IFI Home website, free to access forever, for anyone to watch whenever they want to. And I would urge you all to watch it. It's one of the best cast things I've ever seen. It's incredibly moving, and it will move you to tears at certain points as you watch them drawing further and further apart from each other, unable finally to hear what each other is saying. So that's the good news. More good news. Next weekend, we're going to be back here again, and there are tickets for quite a few of the shows left. One I'd like to single out is James Shapiro, talking about the Federal Theatre Project in America in the 1930s, which was a hugely innovative, state-funded theatre project which allowed people, particularly of minorities, to make and come to the theatre often for the first time in their lives. It's a fascinating story. It's one of FDR's great legacies. Jim Shapiro is a marvellous historian of the theatre, and I think you'll all enjoy it very much, those of you who like history. We've got 2 really good sessions on housing, which we've kind of forgotten about because of our intense interest in Ryan Tubridy, which has taken over the nation. We should have really had a special event on Ryan Tubridy. Yeah. But I don't think he would come, alas. We've got 3 fantastic Belfast women writers who'll be talking about their different perspectives on Belfast. Lucy Caldwell, Wendy Erskine, and oh my God, what is her first name? Rosemary Jenkinson, who is a woman of a loyalist background who's written some of the most scathing satire on her own people that I've ever come across. She's really interesting. So go on the website, get tickets, come and join us next weekend. I'm not wishing that the weather will be bad in any way, although it has packed our houses for the last 2 days. We're very grateful to you all for coming. And please thank again our 3 wonderful historians. Thank you.